Okay, so for rotate clockwise, so the most difficult thing in this assignment was, so when you create your temp image, so if you've not watched flip horizontal, it might be useful. But for rotate clockwise, you create a temporary image just like you did for flipping horizontal, except that you flip-flop the width and the height. And then you go through all the pixels and you grab the pixel from the My Image and you set the pixel in temp. So you're going to flip-flop Y and X, but you want to be a little bit careful. So what do I do to rotate? Let's, I'm going to pause this. Well, let's look. If I'm rotating, the image, the first row ends up being the last column, right? So if I've got this value, my X, this first upper left-hand corner, X is 0, Y is 0, ends up in column 0 and the last row. And then I move over 1, so it changes 1, increases 1 in the X value. This would increase 1 in the Y value. So really, what I see here is my X value in my first image ends up being equal to my Y value in a rotated image, right? Because this first row here ends up as the last column. And then the second row ends up as the second to last column, but all the X values end up equal to the Y values. Then the Y value here, it's the first row, it ends up in the last column. The second row ends up in the second to last column. So what was my Y value ends up being the inverse of my X value. What do I mean by that? So whatever was my X value ends up being my Y value. What was my X value ends up being my Y value. Okay. So my Y value, so whatever was my X value ends up as my Y value. Whatever was my Y value is going to control my X value, but it's the inverse. So I'm going to say something like my image dot height minus Y, and then I've got to do the minus 1 to keep from going out of bounds. This is a really tricky, whoops, it's not height, it's get height. This is a very tricky little formula. Many of you got it, but not everyone did. So, but you can see if I run that, rotate clockwise. Oh, I've got an issue here. It's all black. Why? I'm probably running the wrong one. Okay, so that's what we get. Let's Control Z. And run it before I made my changes. So that's interesting, but it's not rotating it clockwise according to the instructions of the assignment. So notice the beak is pointing off to the left. If I were to rotate clockwise, the head would be on the right-hand side, pointing upward. Rotating clockwise, his method essentially flips it along the diagonal, just by flip-flopping the X and Y. Let's see, who else had problems with this? Let's look at student that I've numbered 6 here. All right, we're not going to work with that. What about student 8? So this one probably crashes because he's using, no, this looks exactly like the last one, except that he's forgot the assignment. We need something like my image equals temp. And then the y value should be my image dot get height minus y minus 1. It's interesting to note that the height of my image is the width of temp. So you could have also said temp dot get width instead of my image dot get height. That's exactly the same thing because the width of temp is equal to the height of my image. Let's look at student 13. Okay, so this is an interesting one. So what is this going to do? If I make sure I've got the right project current and I try to run it, and I say rotate clockwise, it rotates and everything goes black. Why? So the first time through this loop, they grab the pixel at 0 in the x, 1 in the y. So you should probably start y out as 0. And then they change the y and x value so that y is equal to the width minus 1. The x is equal to the height minus 1. And they set a pixel in temp. They assign temp to my image, so they've assigned 1 pixel and then replaced my image. That explains kind of why it goes black. But you might have expected, because they've got x in the x and y in the y, and the height and width aren't right, you might have expected it to segfault, except that when y is equal to the width, say the width is 500, then you add 1. Okay, so this would give you a 499. You add 1, and now it's not less than it's basically making x and y so big that it's going to exit the loop early. I'd have to think through exactly what how many times it's going to go through the loop and what's getting assigned. It may always just jump out. It may even crash with certain images, depending on whether the height and width is bigger. Now let's try that. So I've got an image here. I think Cool 2 was taller than it is wide. The other one are all wider than they are tall. Rotate clockwise. No, it doesn't crash, but it's certainly not doing what it's supposed to do. So we don't want to destroy our x and y values, otherwise that messes up our going through the loop and causes us to go through the loop an improper number of times, and x and y aren't set to the appropriate values the next time through the loop. So we'd really rather have y and x and some equation. If we wanted to, we could say we could do something like this, and this is a little bit tricky, but you could say int y2 is equal to temp dot get height, and then y minus minus, I think, or y2 minus minus. And then use y2 here. I think this will work. Because the idea is we're going to go through the y values. So each time through this inner loop, the x value is the same. And it starts out as I think it's temp.getWidth here. Instead of getHeight. Nope, that's still not right. So I don't know exactly what's wrong with this. I know it's an array index out of bounds. Let's see each time through this loop what our values are for y2 and x2. Y2 and x. And here in these first 3 lines of the error message are things that are a part of the library, sun.awt.image, java.awt.image. But right here, photopanel.rotateClockwise, that's the first thing in our code that is in error. If we click on this, it'll jump and it'll show us exactly which line of code crashed. It's important that we know exactly which line got the array index out of bounds. It gives us a little insight as to what exactly crashed it. So let's run this again and see what our values are and where it crashes. You notice it took a little bit longer because it was outputting a bunch of stuff. So our first value that we see here is y2. So it's crashing when that y2 becomes negative. Why? Seems like I know why. This should be a y. No, that should be x. What if I started out at .getHeight? That doesn't seem right to me. Yeah, still crashes probably the same. 599, comma 0. Okay, it took me a little bit to figure it out, but there's this my image equals temp, same mistake we've seen in the past. And since the rows and columns are different for temp and my image, as soon as you replace my image with temp, you end up destroying the width and height of my image, so it ends up going through these loops the wrong number of times, and that'll end up causing a crash because of the way that I happen to implement this here, where it's decrementing y2. So if I put that down outside of the double for loops, that should, I hope, work. I haven't tested it while the video is off, and it's doing a bunch of print statements, and hey, it worked. So just wanted you to see that there are other ways of doing this. This is actually just a little tiny bit more efficient because it doesn't have to do a full calculation every time through the loop. All it's got to do is decrement y. Noticing that it's starting out with the last column, and then it's working its way into the first column. And so if y2 is holding the column of the destination image, then you can just set it to the last column and decrement each time. So while this y is going up, this one is going down. And so that was student 13. Let's see if we can go to 15 and 16 very quickly, and then end this video. Okay, so if they got a variable xy, setting it equal to 0, and a negative 0 is just 0, they're always setting to the 0 x value, and then the y value is equal to x, as it should be. And they're also doing this assignment inside of the loop. So this is a very common mistake here, I guess. And that's not going to work right there. It would have to do something else right here. And we've seen a couple of solutions for that. I'm not going to spend any more time on this one. And number 16. Okay, I'm not going to spend any more time on that. So that's rotate clockwise. I'll make a separate video for make gray, swap, invert, lighten, and darken. Thanks.